Prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the unknown as we delve into 7 spine-tingling Wendigo encounters that will haunt your dreams. Join us as we explore these terrifying tales, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more bone-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. In the heart of winter, northern Minnesota's forests are no place for the faint of heart. The locals know better than to wander too far after dark, for they believe something ancient prowls in the endless woods. They call it the Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger, cursed to roam the land with a craving for flesh. The stories say that once it catches your scent, there's no escaping. It's an endless hunter, driven by a madness that consumes everything in its path. Tom had always laughed off these tales as superstitious nonsense, dismissing them as ghost stories used to scare children. But when his childhood friends, Rachel and Ben, invited him on a weekend hike into the pine woods, he didn't know this trip would change everything he believed. The air was biting as the trio set out, their breath clouding in the cold as they trudged through snow that crunched beneath their boots. Towering pines flanked them on either side, casting long shadows that seemed to watch them as they moved deeper into the forest. The sun was already sinking, casting a fiery glow over the treetops. Tom pulled his coat tighter, feeling the chill settle in. Despite the vastness of the wilderness, there was a strange sense of confinement, as if the trees themselves were closing in on them. As night began to fall, the silence grew heavy, only broken by the occasional crack of branches underfoot and the distant calls of crows. Every so often, Tom thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, too quick to make out. "Do you feel that?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom and Ben exchanged a look. "Feel what?" Tom replied. "It's like something's watching us," she said, shivering. Ben laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Relax, wretch. It's just us and the trees out here. Besides, if there were a Wendigo, wouldn't we have heard it by now?" But as they moved further into the forest, even Ben's confidence seemed to wane. The shadows grew thicker, the trees more twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers, and the feeling that they weren't alone became harder to shake. Tom, a skeptical and practical type, Tom had always been dismissive of supernatural legends. He grew up hearing about the Wendigo but never gave it much thought. Now in his late 20s, he was eager to reconnect with his friends, but was more interested in a good hike than any ghost stories. Rachel, sensitive and attuned to her surroundings, Rachel had always been interested in folklore and the supernatural. She was the one who had proposed this hiking trip, hoping to have an adventure. However, she now regretted bringing up the Wendigo legend. The forest's atmosphere had shaken her confidence. Ben, the jokester of the group, Ben was always trying to make his friends laugh, even when things got tense. He had a knack for turning serious situations into lighthearted ones. But deep down, he was just as nervous as Rachel, although he'd never let it show. As night settled fully, the trio felt an unease they couldn't explain. The air was thick, heavy with something they couldn't identify, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They decided to set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. A fire crackled in the center, casting flickering light on their faces. Ben opened a can of beans, while Tom went about securing the tent. Rachel sat quietly, staring into the forest, her face tense. "Hey, you okay?" Ben asked, nudging her with his elbow. Rachel looked up, startled. "Yeah, just thought I saw something moving out there. It was probably nothing." Tom laughed. "Come on, Rachel. We're in the woods. Animals live here. That's probably all it was." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling. Just as she was about to brush it off, a low, almost inaudible sound drifted through the trees. It wasn't the wind, but a whisper, faint, like the murmur of voices too far away to hear clearly. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom and Ben paused, listening. The whisper grew louder, echoing through the trees, though still incomprehensible. It was a chorus of overlapping voices, as though dozens of people were murmuring in the shadows, their voices carrying a tone of anguish and desperation. "I don't like this," Ben muttered, his usual bravado gone. Maybe we should go back. But as they turned to pack up, they saw something moving between the trees, just beyond the fire's reach. A figure, tall and skeletal, with limbs that seemed far too long. Its eyes gleamed faintly, reflecting the firelight as it watched them with a ravenous intensity. "Is that?" Rachel's voice trembled, her face draining of color. Tom took a step back, his heart pounding. The stories his grandmother used to tell him flooded his mind. He could almost hear her voice, warning him of the Wendigo's hunger, its endless search for flesh. "Stay still," he whispered. "Don't move." The creature shifted, stepping forward into the firelight. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. Its face was hollow, eyes sunken deep in its skull, but its mouth was filled with jagged, broken teeth, bared in a perpetual snarl. The Wendigo. The three friends froze, fear gripping them in place as the creature began to circle, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the clearing with an unholy chorus that seemed to come from the Wendigo itself. "Run!" Tom shouted, breaking the silence as the creature lunged forward. They bolted in different directions, scattering through the trees, hearts pounding as they pushed through the underbrush. The Wendigo's snarls echoed behind them, the sound growing closer with each heartbeat. Tom sprinted, lungs burning, but he could hear Rachel scream somewhere in the distance. He stumbled, falling into a snowbank, and looked back just in time to see the Wendigo dragging her back into the shadows. Her screams faded, swallowed by the forest. Guilt and horror twisted in his gut, but he forced himself to keep running. He couldn't save her. All he could do now was survive. Ben was nowhere to be seen, but the Wendigo's growls told Tom that it was still hunting, still craving. As he ran, the forest seemed to warp around him, every tree a twisted, gnarled figure, every shadow a reminder of the thing pursuing him. Finally, he reached a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. He thought he was safe until he heard Ben's voice, faint and desperate. Tom, help me." Relief surged through him. "Ben, where are you?" But as he followed the voice, he realized something was wrong. The voice sounded wrong, distorted, like someone speaking through broken glass. "Tom, over here." The voice was closer now, coming from the shadows. He stopped, heart pounding, and then he saw it, the Wendigo, standing just at the edge of the clearing, its head tilted, watching him with Ben's voice spilling from its mouth. "Tom, help me," it rasped, mocking, taunting him with his friend's voice. Tom backed away, but the creature advanced, its jagged teeth bared, eyes glowing with a feral hunger. He stumbled, scrambling to get away, but the Wendigo was faster, closing the distance with unnatural speed. He could feel its cold breath on his neck as it loomed over him, its mouth opening wide. Desperation took over, and he grabbed a nearby rock, swinging it with all his strength. The creature shrieked, recoiling. Tom took his chance, sprinting blindly into the forest, the Wendigo's screams echoing behind him. By some miracle, he made it back to the edge of the woods. His body ached, his mind reeling with the horror of what he had witnessed. As he stumbled onto the main road, he collapsed, looking back one last time. In the distance, between the trees, he saw a pair of glowing eyes watching him, the promise that this was far from over. The Wendigo's whispers still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the creature's hunger. Tom knew he had escaped with his life, but he'd never be free, because once the Wendigo had your scent, it would never stop hunting. The town of Hollow Creek was quiet in the winter. Snow muffled every sound, casting a silent, haunting beauty over the landscape. To the townsfolk, the snow was both a blessing and a curse, beautiful to watch from inside, but deadly if you found yourself stranded in it. But there was one thing that everyone feared more than the cold. Stories of the Wendigo had been passed down for generations, tales of a creature that came in winter, with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Some said it was a cursed spirit, born from the greed of man. Others believed it was once a person, transformed by their own desperate hunger in the dead of winter. All agreed on one thing. Once you saw it, there was no escape. This year, that terror would visit Hollow Creek again. Night had fallen over the small, isolated cabin where Eli Fisher had chosen to spend his winter break. He'd come up from the city, hoping to escape the noise and stress, to find peace in the woods. The cabin was old, abandoned for years, but Eli didn't mind. He was a writer after all, and places like this inspired him. The cabin stood at the edge of Black Pine Forest, the last structure before the endless trees swallowed the land. The locals had warned him not to go too far into the woods, especially at night. He'd laughed off their warnings, thinking they were just trying to scare him. That first night, though, he'd started to feel differently. As darkness settled, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds, faint whispers drifting through the trees, a low, mournful howl carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was an animal, a wolf maybe, or the groaning of old trees. But something about the sound gnawed at him, a primal fear that he couldn't shake. Eli Fisher, a struggling writer from the city. Eli is in his late 20s and feels disillusioned with life. Seeking inspiration, he's rented a remote cabin near Black Pine Forest to finish his novel. Skeptical of the supernatural, he prides himself on his logical mind, though he's haunted by an unnamed emptiness. Maria, Eli's friend and former girlfriend. Maria is also a writer, but more practical than Eli. She'd come up to visit him for the weekend, reluctantly agreeing to a camping trip despite her unease about the forest. She's attuned to her surroundings and believes in trusting her instincts. Jake, a local ranger in Hollow Creek. Jake has grown up with tales of the Wendigo. He's friendly and helpful but superstitious. When he meets Eli at the local store, he warns him to be careful, especially if he hears voices at night. Jake has seen too many things he can't explain, and he knows that Black Pine hides secrets. On the second night, Maria arrived at the cabin, shivering from the cold. Eli greeted her with a warm hug, but even he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He tried to distract her, talking about the book he was working on, but the mood remained tense. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, sharing stories and laughing, but the laughter felt hollow, as if the walls themselves were absorbing it. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the windows with a persistent, almost desperate force. "Do you hear that?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli strained to listen. Beyond the crackling fire, he could hear it, the faintest of whispers, like someone calling from far away. He shook his head, dismissing it as the wind. "It's just the trees," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the whispers grew louder, closer. Soon, it was no longer a single voice, but many, overlapping, calling out in pain and sorrow. Maria grabbed Eli's arm, her face pale. "We should leave. Now." Before Eli could answer, there was a scratching at the door, a slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down their spines. They exchanged a fearful glance, both too terrified to move. Who's there?" Eli called, his voice shaking. There was no answer, just silence. But then, slowly, the scratching resumed, dragging nails or claws down the wooden door, making their hearts pound in terror. Eli took a step back, unsure of what to do, while Maria clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white. "Maybe it's a bear," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Maria shook her head. "That's no bear, Eli. There's something out there." Just as she spoke, a face appeared at the window, pale, with hollow, black eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. It was there for only a second, but that was enough. Eli stumbled back, horrified. He felt something deep within him, a pull, as if the creature's gaze was drawing him in. That's the Wendigo," he whispered, the realization dawning on him with paralyzing fear. The creature's face disappeared, and the scratching stopped, but they could hear footsteps circling the cabin, slow and heavy, as though it was savoring the moment, relishing their fear. "We need to go," Maria hissed, pulling Eli toward the back door. "Now." But Eli hesitated, transfixed by the fear and the strange, dark pull of the creature. He felt something within him, an insatiable hunger, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow stronger as he stared at the door. "Eli, snap out of it," Maria yelled, snapping him out of his trance. They bolted out the back, stumbling through the snow, the cold biting into their skin. They could hear the creature's footsteps behind them, closing the distance, its rasping breath filling the air. The trees loomed around them, dark and ominous, as if they were closing in, trapping them in the creature's domain. Maria stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow. Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her up, but the Wendigo was close now, close enough that they could see its twisted form, a skeletal figure, impossibly tall, with arms that dragged across the ground, fingers ending in claws. Its face was stretched like a mask of dried skin over bone, and its eyes were pits of darkness, pulling them in. Eli felt the pull again, the hunger consuming him from the inside. He heard the voices in his mind, whispering promises of power, of endless feasting, of a freedom that came from letting go of his humanity. Maria screamed, pulling him back, her voice breaking through the haze. "Don't listen to it. Eli, please. Don't let it take you." But Eli could barely hear her. The Wendigo's eyes were all he could see, its whispers all he could hear. It was offering him an escape from his emptiness, an escape from his pain. All he had to do was surrender, let the hunger take over. He took a step forward, reaching out to the creature. "No," Maria screamed, throwing herself between Eli and the Wendigo. Her voice shattered the trance, and he blinked, suddenly aware of the freezing cold, of the tears streaming down her face. The Wendigo snarled, its mouth opening wider, jagged teeth glinting in the moonlight as it lunged forward. Eli grabbed Maria's hand, and they ran, stumbling through the snow. The forest seemed endless, each step harder than the last, the Wendigo's growls echoing around them. They could feel it right behind them, the air growing colder with each step. Finally, they saw a light through the trees, a ranger's cabin. "Jake!" Eli shouted, recognizing the figure of the local ranger standing on the porch. Jake's face went pale as he saw the Wendigo behind him, but he raised his rifle, firing a shot that echoed through the forest. The creature shrieked, a sound that rattled through their bones, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it stalked closer, its gaze locked on Eli, its hunger unrelenting. Eli and Maria scrambled inside, collapsing on the floor as Jake locked the door behind them. The Wendigo's face appeared at the window, staring at Eli, its whispers still pulling at him, calling to the hunger within him. Jake lit a sage bundle, muttering an old prayer under his breath, and the creature hissed, retreating from the smoke, though its eyes never left Eli. "It won't stop hunting you," Jake said grimly, his voice shaking. "Once it's marked you, it won't give up. What do we do?" Maria asked, clutching Eli's hand. Jake looked at them, his eyes dark with fear. "We pray it doesn't come back before dawn, and after that you leave this place. You don't ever come back." Eli and Maria stayed in the ranger's cabin, listening to the Wendigo's whispers just outside the door, feeling its eyes on them through the long, agonizing hours of the night. But it didn't break through, kept at bay by the smoke and the old prayers Jake whispered. When dawn finally broke, the small town of Whispering Pines was hidden deep in the woods, far from any major city. It was the kind of place people visited for a weekend getaway or a peaceful escape from their everyday lives. But this winter, the locals sensed something sinister lurking in the shadows. Animals went missing, eerie sounds filled the night, and anyone who wandered too far into the forest never came back the same, if they came back at all. But none of that bothered Ben and his friends. They were out here for an adventure, a chance to experience the wilderness and maybe hear a few ghost stories. Little did they know, one of those stories was about to come to life. Setting the scene, the Whispering Pines campground was nestled at the edge of an ancient forest. Towering pines surrounded the area, their branches heavy with snow. The trees were so thick that sunlight barely made it through, casting long shadows even during the day. At night, the only light came from the stars and the occasional flicker of a flashlight. Ben, Nate, and Lisa set up their tents by a frozen lake. their breath visible in the chilly night air. They gathered around a crackling fire, swapping stories and laughing, the cold momentarily forgotten. They'd driven out from the city, thrilled at the idea of being disconnected and away from everything. The town's name had a certain charm. Whispering Pines sounded like the perfect place for adventure. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded, and an unsettling quiet settled over the campsite. Ben, a thrill-seeker at heart, Ben is in his early 30s and thrives on adventure. He organized the camping trip, convincing his friends to leave the comforts of the city. He doesn't believe in the supernatural, viewing stories of monsters and spirits as entertainment rather than warning. Nate, practical and level-headed. Nate is the first to worry when things start feeling wrong. He has an instinct for survival and trusts his gut. Though he came along on Ben's invitation, he's been feeling uneasy about the trip since they arrived in Whispering Pines. Lisa, sensitive and intuitive, Lisa is fascinated by the supernatural but often fears it too. She's read about the Wendigo before and even joked about it on the drive up, unaware of how real those legends could be. As the fire died down, the friends began to feel the weight of the dark forest around them. A silence fell over the campsite, a silence so profound that it was almost as if the forest was holding its breath. Ever heard of the Wendigo? Lisa asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The others looked at her, curious but wary. It's an old Native American legend, she continued. They say the Wendigo was once a person, but hunger drove them mad. They became a monster, cursed, always starving, never satisfied. It hunts in the winter, stalking anyone who gets too close. Ben laughed, though his voice sounded hollow. Come on, Lisa. This is just another campfire story. But Nate shivered, glancing around the dark forest. I don't know, something about this place doesn't feel right. Just then, they heard a faint noise, like a branch snapping in the distance. They froze, listening. The sound was far away, but it was getting closer, slow and deliberate, each step louder than the last. It's probably just an animal, Ben said, though he didn't sound so sure. But Lisa knew better. She felt an icy dread settle over her, a fear that went beyond any story she'd ever heard. Something was out there, something watching them. The noise stopped, and for a moment, all was quiet again. But then, in the silence, they heard something that made their blood run cold. A voice. It sounded like Lisa's voice, calling from somewhere deep in the forest, soft and pleading. Ben, Nate, please help. Lisa's eyes widened. That's my voice. How is that possible? Nate backed away, shaking his head. No, we're not going in there. It's trying to lure us out. But Ben's curiosity got the better of him. Maybe someone's lost. It could be an echo or something else. He took a step toward the trees, but Lisa grabbed his arm, pulling him back. No, Ben, that's not an echo. That's something else. Before they could argue, a shadow moved between the trees, a shape barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch in unnatural ways. The creature's face was obscured, but its eyes glinted in the moonlight. Two pits of darkness, hungry and malevolent. It stepped closer, and they saw it clearly. The creature was like nothing they'd ever seen. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent, and its mouth was filled with jagged, yellow teeth. Its eyes held no humanity, only hunger. The Wendigo let out a low, rumbling growl, its eyes locking onto Ben. He stumbled back, heart racing, as the creature advanced, each step slow and deliberate, as if savoring their terror. Run, he shouted, grabbing Lisa and Nate. They turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature moved faster than seemed possible, its long limbs carrying it effortlessly over the snow. It was gaining on them, its growls echoing through the forest, sending a primal fear through their bones. Nate tripped, falling face first into the snow. He scrambled to get up, but the Wendigo was right there, towering over him. Its mouth opened wide, a horrible, unnatural scream filling the air. Ben grabbed Nate's arm, pulling him to his feet just as the creature lunged, its claws swiping through the air where Nate had just been. They ran harder, their lungs burning, but the Wendigo was relentless, its hollow eyes fixed on them. It moved with an eerie silence now, as if gliding over the snow, its hunger palpable, pressing down on them like a weight. Lisa screamed as it closed in, her voice echoing through the empty forest. They could feel it right behind them, its breath icy against their necks. Just when they thought they couldn't run anymore, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin hidden in the trees. The door was ajar, barely hanging on its hinges, but it was shelter. Inside! Hurry! Ben shouted. They burst into the cabin, slamming the door behind them. They could hear the Wendigo outside, its claws scraping against the walls, its low growl vibrating through the thin wood. They backed away from the door, breathing heavily, their eyes wide with fear. What do we do? Nate asked, his voice shaking. Ben looked around, desperate. The cabin was empty, cold, and dark, with broken windows and a rotting floor. But then he noticed something on the wall, charcoal symbols drawn in a circle, surrounding an old, broken mirror. It's a protective symbol, Lisa whispered. I read about it once. If we stay inside, maybe it can't reach us. But as they huddled together, the Wendigo's voice echoed through the cabin, soft and mocking. It called to them, mimicking their voices, speaking their names with an eerie familiarity. Its whispers slithered into their minds, filling them with a gnawing hunger, a darkness that clawed at their souls. The creature began to scratch at the walls, and they could see its shadow moving outside the windows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Then the whispers grew louder, filling the cabin, drowning out their thoughts. Ben felt a strange urge to go to the door, to open it, to let the Wendigo in. He took a step forward, his eyes blank, his mind fogged. But Lisa grabbed his arm, snapping him out of the trance. No, don't listen to it. They held each other, clinging to the faint hope that the symbols would keep them safe. But as the hours dragged on, the creature's whispers continued, its hunger relentless, wearing down their resolve. Finally, as dawn broke, the creature let out a furious shriek and disappeared into the forest, leaving them trembling and exhausted. When the sun rose, they emerged from the cabin, their faces pale, their bodies aching. They stumbled back to the campsite, silent, each haunted by the memories of the night. They packed their things, leaving Whispering Pines without looking back. But as they drove away, Lisa looked into the trees and thought she saw something, a shadow watching them, waiting for its next prey. The Wendigo was still out there, hungry, patient, and it would wait as long as it took for someone else to wander too close. In the dead of winter, a group of researchers set out into the vast, untouched wilderness of the northern Canadian forest. They were on a mission to study the impact of extreme weather on local wildlife, funded by a prestigious environmental organization. But what started as a scientific expedition would soon become a fight for survival. The forest had a reputation, known by locals as a place where people vanished without a trace. Villagers warned them about an ancient legend, a creature born from cold and starvation, cursed to roam the woods forever, always hungry, always hunting. But the researchers brushed off the tales, chalking them up to folklore. They had no idea that something was waiting for them, hidden among the trees. The camp was set up in a remote area, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by towering trees and deep snow. The sun barely reached this part of the forest, leaving the world in a permanent shade of twilight. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The group consisted of 5 researchers, each equipped with winter survival gear, high-tech monitoring equipment, and enough provisions to last for weeks. But the dense silence and the constant shadows soon began to weigh on them, filling them with a sense of unease. Every so often, they heard strange sounds in the distance, branches snapping, something moving just out of sight. At night, a biting cold settled over the camp, a chill so deep that even their thermal blankets couldn't keep it out. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, gnawing at them, whispering of something ancient and hungry. Dr. Ethan Michaels, a biologist and the team leader. Ethan is in his late 40s, a seasoned researcher who has spent most of his life in the field. He is rational, logical, and skeptical of anything he can't see or measure. Ethan prides himself on his scientific approach, dismissing the local legends. Lily Saunders, the team's ecologist. Lily is young, passionate, and somewhat spiritual. She has a strong connection to nature and a deep respect for indigenous folklore. Lily was the only one uneasy about the expedition, feeling as though they were intruding on something sacred. Tom Carter, the equipment technician and survival expert. Tom is tough and resourceful, always the first to jump into action. He grew up in a rural town and has heard tales of strange creatures in the woods, but believes most of them to be exaggerations. Rebecca Lynn, an ornithologist fascinated by the migration patterns of northern birds. Rebecca is quiet but observant, often catching small details others miss. She becomes the first to notice the unusual patterns around them, the animals behaving strangely, as if disturbed by something. James Jimmy Blackwood, a young intern and aspiring wildlife photographer. Jimmy is enthusiastic, eager to prove himself, but also prone to nervousness. He's the first to sense that something is wrong in the forest. The first few days passed uneventfully, with the team settling into a routine. But Lily noticed that the animals seemed to avoid the area around their camp. The usual signs of life, tracks, droppings, or distant bird calls, were strangely absent. It was as if the forest itself was empty. One night, Jimmy woke up to the sound of whispering. He sat up, straining his ears, and realized the whispering was coming from outside his tent. The voice was soft and pleading, calling his name. "Jimmy, please come outside." He unzipped the tent, peeking out into the darkness, but saw nothing. His heart pounded as he scanned the trees, but the forest was still. The others dismissed his experience as a dream, a trick of his overactive imagination. But Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. A few nights later, Rebecca noticed strange marks on the trees around their camp. They looked like claw marks, but they were too large and deep for any animal she knew. She pointed it out to the others, but Ethan brushed it off, claiming it was likely from a bear. But Lily wasn't so sure. She'd heard stories of creatures in the North Woods that didn't belong to the natural world, spirits that wandered in the winter, hunting those who dared to enter their domain. She whispered one word, barely loud enough for the others to hear. Wendigo. On the sixth night, the wind howled through the trees, bringing with it an unnatural cold that bit through their clothing. They huddled in the main tent, trying to warm themselves by a small portable heater, but the cold only grew stronger, settling in their bones. Suddenly, they heard a scream from outside, a raw, gut-wrenching sound that cut through the silence. It was Jimmy. They rushed outside to find him standing by the edge of the camp, staring into the trees with wide, terrified eyes. His skin was pale, his breath visible in the icy air, and he was shaking uncontrollably. It was there, he stammered, pointing into the darkness. I saw it tall, with hollow eyes. It was watching me. The others tried to calm him down, but Jimmy kept muttering about the creature, describing its gaunt body, its sharp, jagged teeth, and the endless hunger in its eyes. That night, none of them could sleep. They huddled together, keeping the lights on, listening to every sound outside. Around midnight, they heard it again, the sound of something heavy moving through the snow, slow and deliberate, as if circling their camp. Ethan finally admitted that something was out there, but he was determined to understand it. He and Tom decided to investigate, venturing a little way into the forest with their flashlights. They walked cautiously, scanning the shadows, the beams of their lights cutting through the trees. Then they saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of their lights, tall and skeletal, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, its eyes deep pits of darkness. The creature's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The Wendigo let out a low, guttural growl, its voice like the sound of ice cracking. Ethan and Tom backed away slowly, but the creature lunged, moving faster than seemed possible. They turned and ran, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind them. They barely made it back to camp, slamming the tent flap closed behind them. But they knew it was only a matter of time before the creature came for them. The group huddled in terror, trying to think of a way out. Lily, desperate, remembered something from the legends. The Wendigo is driven by hunger. It's cursed to consume endlessly, but never be satisfied. But they say fire can drive it away, at least temporarily. They grabbed what little fire-starting equipment they had, planning to light torches and keep the creature at bay until dawn. But just as they prepared, the Wendigo's voice filled the tent, soft and mocking, mimicking each of their voices in turn. "Ethan, Tom, Lily, come to me. I'm so hungry." The voices clawed at their minds, filling them with a cold dread. Ethan, determined to end this, grabbed a flare and stepped outside, the others following reluctantly. They formed a circle, their torches raised, and waited. The Wendigo emerged from the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its bony limbs stretching out. Ethan raised the flare, thrusting it toward the creature. For a moment, it recoiled, hissing, but then it lunged, knocking him to the ground. The others backed away as Ethan struggled beneath the creature's grip, his screams echoing through the forest. In a desperate move, Tom threw his torch at the Wendigo, the flames licking at its skin. The creature shrieked, retreating into the shadows, leaving Ethan behind. They pulled him up, but he was badly hurt, his skin pale, his eyes hollow. The creature had left its mark on him, and they could see a change in his face, a hunger that hadn't been there before. The remaining group stumbled through the forest, leaving the camp and their equipment behind. They walked all night, terrified that the Wendigo was still following them. By morning, they made it to the edge of the forest, exhausted, freezing, and shaken. But Ethan was different. His eyes were sunken, his movements slow and unnatural. When they reached the town, he barely spoke, only watching the others with a strange, ravenous look. Lily knew then that the Wendigo's curse had spread to him. Though they had escaped the forest, the hunger had followed them, a curse passed down, infecting those it touched. They left Whispering Pines in silence, but Lily knew the truth. She saw it in Ethan's empty eyes. The Wendigo wasn't finished, and it was only a matter of time before the hunger returned. And so the curse spread, carried out of the forest, a hunger that could never be satisfied, always waiting, always watching, ready to consume. The old truck rattled and groaned as it pulled up to the forest's edge, coming to a halt beneath a sign that read Snow Ridge National Park. Winter camping at your own risk. The sign looked weathered, the letters barely visible beneath a layer of ice and grime. As Ben killed the engine, the quiet of the surrounding forest enveloped them. "Welcome to the edge of the world," he joked, hopping out into the knee-deep snow. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, eyeing the looming trees with a mix of awe and unease. "Are we sure this is safe? It feels empty. Come on, don't tell me you're chickening out already." Ben grinned. "This is exactly what we wanted. No cell reception, no people. Just us and miles of wilderness." Jason, the quietest of the group, joined them, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "Sarah's right, though. This place is different. I can feel it. Just the cold getting to your heads," Ben said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Come on, let's set up camp before it gets dark." As they made their way deeper into the forest, Sarah noticed a small, faded note pinned to the forest bulletin. Scrawled in barely legible handwriting were the words, "Beware the Wendigo." They hiked through the dense, silent woods until they reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The snow lay thick on the ground, absorbing sound and casting everything into an eerie stillness. They set up their tents, building a small fire to keep the encroaching cold at bay. The smoke rose in thin wisps, quickly swallowed by the darkening sky. "Did you see that note back there?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, come on, Sarah. Don't start with that," Ben scoffed, rolling his eyes. "The Wendigo is just a story, a legend meant to scare kids." Jason poked at the fire, his gaze unfocused. "It's more than that, Ben. People say it's a creature born from winter's hunger, something that used to be human but isn't anymore. The legend goes that anyone who succumbs to the spirit of greed or hunger in these woods becomes one of them, a Wendigo." Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "I heard it's cursed to wander forever, starving, feeding off anything it finds, even people. Ben shook his head. It's folklore, nothing more. Now, can we enjoy this trip without ghost stories? But as the night deepened, even Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Every so often, they heard distant noises, twigs snapping, soft whispering on the wind, footsteps that stopped whenever they turned to look. Around the fire, they shared stories, trying to dispel the eerie atmosphere. But each of them held something back, a hidden fear, a private memory of something that had made them question what lay beyond the known world. Ben, the skeptic, recalled how he had lost a sibling in an accident, leaving him hardened and cynical, unwilling to believe in anything he couldn't see or explain. He hid his fears behind logic and scorned anything that hinted at the supernatural. Sarah, however, had grown up with stories of spirits and monsters. Her grandmother, an Ojibwe elder, had warned her of creatures in the woods, spirits that punished the reckless and the greedy. Sarah believed in the Wendigo, not just as a monster, but as a force of nature. Jason, practical and dependable, was caught between the two. He wanted to believe Ben's logic, but couldn't ignore the strange pull of the forest, the feeling that something was watching them. Around the fire, they shared stories, trying to dispel the eerie atmosphere. But each of them held something back, a hidden fear, a private memory of something that had made them question what lay beyond the known world. Ben, the skeptic, recalled how he had lost a sibling in an accident, leaving him hardened and cynical, unwilling to believe in anything he couldn't see or explain. He hid his fears behind logic and scorned anything that hinted at the supernatural. Sarah, however, had grown up with stories of spirits and monsters. Her grandmother, an Ojibwe elder, had warned her of creatures in the woods, spirits that punished the reckless and the greedy. Sarah believed in the Wendigo, not just as a monster, but as a force of nature. Jason, practical and dependable, was caught between the two. He wanted to believe Ben's logic, but couldn't ignore the strange pull of the forest, the feeling that something was watching them. Around the fire, they shared stories, trying to dispel the eerie atmosphere. But each of them held something back, a hidden fear, a private memory of something that had made them question what lay beyond the known world. Ben, the skeptic, recalled how he had lost a sibling in an accident, leaving him hardened and cynical, unwilling to believe in anything he couldn't see or explain. He hid his fears behind logic and scorned anything that hinted at the supernatural. Sarah, however, had grown up with stories of spirits and monsters. Her grandmother, an Ojibwe elder, had warned her of creatures in the woods, spirits that punished the reckless and the greedy. Sarah believed in the Wendigo, not just as a monster, but as a force of nature. Jason, practical and dependable, was caught between the two. He wanted to believe Ben's logic, but couldn't ignore the strange pull of the forest, the feeling that something was watching them. The sky was an endless gray as Adam, Ella, and Luke trudged deeper into the wild heart of Frost Hollow. Winter had wrapped the forest in a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots on frozen snow. They had come for adventure, a weekend getaway to test their limits and escape the humdrum of city life. But Frost Hollow had a darker history than any of them knew, and it was about to make itself known. "I still don't understand why we picked this place," Luke muttered, pulling his scarf tighter. His breath hung in clouds in the frigid air. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, really. Ella laughed, though her eyes darted nervously between the snow-laden trees. "Come on, it's supposed to be haunted. Don't you love a good ghost story?" Adam rolled his eyes. "Ghosts aren't real. You're just scaring yourself. This is a great chance to get away from everything. A little bit of cold won't kill us." But as the forest loomed dark and silent around them, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight, waiting for nightfall. The cabin appeared as the light began to fade, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. It was old, its wooden beams gray with age, the windows covered in frost. A single path led up to the door, partially hidden under the fresh snow, as though it hadn't been walked in years. As they made their way inside, Ella spotted something carved into the frame above the door. Strange, crooked letters scratched into the wood, faded with time. She traced her fingers over them, shivering. What do you think it means? It's probably just an old warning, Luke replied, shoving her playfully. Maybe about bears or something. But Ella couldn't ignore the way the letters seemed to spell out a word, one her grandmother used to tell stories about, in hushed tones, as if speaking it aloud would summon it. Wendigo. They settled in, lighting the old fireplace and cooking a simple meal. The heat was comforting, but it barely pushed back the cold pressing in from outside. The walls of the cabin felt thin, almost flimsy, as if the forest could break through at any moment. Did you know this forest was sacred to the First Nations? Ella murmured as they sat by the fire. They said it was haunted, that there was something out here, hungry for those who lose their way. Adam laughed. It's just an old tale, Ella. A monster that punishes greed. That's ridiculous. But Luke didn't laugh. He looked out the window, his eyes narrowing at the dark shapes of the trees. You're both right. It's a story, but it's not just about greed. It's about hunger, the kind that grows when you're lost, when you're alone. Adam, the group leader, a skeptic who thrives on logical thinking. He's determined to prove that nothing supernatural exists. Ella, a believer in the supernatural, drawn to legends and folklore. She has a fascination with the unknown, though she tries to laugh off her own fears. Luke, practical and a little superstitious. Luke is haunted by a childhood memory of getting lost in the woods. He feels the weight of the legends more than the others, sensing something they don't. Each friend brought a different perspective to the trip, but the forest had a way of chipping away at their resolve. Already, the silence had started to weigh on them, filling their thoughts with uneasy whispers. The first night passed quietly, but they woke to find strange, elongated footprints in the snow around the cabin. Deep prints that led in erratic circles before vanishing into the trees. Adam shrugged it off as animal tracks, probably just an elk or something. But Ella noticed that the prints looked strangely human, albeit with distorted, unnatural proportions. By the second night, the cabin felt colder. The fire seemed unable to keep the chill at bay, and the windows frosted over faster than they could clear them. They heard noises, faint whispers on the wind, and distant, hollow howling that set Ella's nerves on edge. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adam brushed it off. "It's the wind, nothing more." But Luke wasn't so sure. "I don't think it's the wind, Adam. There's something wrong here." They tried to ignore the sounds, burying themselves in sleeping bags and turning up their music. But in the dead of night, Ella woke with a start. A shadow loomed outside the cabin window, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. She screamed, but when Adam and Luke woke and looked outside, there was nothing there. "It was real," she whispered, trembling. "I swear it was real." But Adam only shook his head, insisting it was a dream. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of dread that filled the cabin, the feeling that something was slowly tightening its grip around them. The third night was worse. A fierce blizzard hit, howling and rattling the walls of the cabin. The fire sputtered and died, leaving them huddled in darkness, the only light coming from their small, flickering flashlights. As they huddled close, the whispering began again, louder this time, as if coming from all around them. Words they couldn't understand, voices that sounded hollow and distant. Then they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. Who is it? Ella's voice shook, but no one answered. A loud bang echoed through the cabin as something scratched at the door, deep gouges that splintered the wood. Then silence. Adam, heart pounding, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, hoping to scare off whatever was outside. Nothing was there, but when he closed the door, he saw them, claw marks on the inside of the door, deep and freshly made. Luke was shivering uncontrollably, his skin pale and his eyes wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered. "The Wendigo. It's come for us." Adam was about to argue, but then they heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the night, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls of the cabin. The hunger in the air was palpable, an ancient, insatiable craving that clawed at their minds, making them feel weak, tired, starved. Desperation drove them into the storm, hoping to escape whatever was inside the cabin with them. But the forest was even darker, the trees closing in as if guiding them deeper into the heart of Frost Hollow. They ran blindly through the snow, hearing the heavy footsteps behind them, feeling the creature's eyes on their backs. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps grew closer, the whispers louder, filling their minds with chilling thoughts of starvation and endless hunger. Finally, they stopped, breathless and frozen, only to find themselves in a clearing. And there, in the shadows, stood the Wendigo. It was monstrous, tall and skeletal, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones, its hollow eyes fixed on them with a ravenous stare. Antlers jutted from its skull, and its mouth was a twisted grin, filled with jagged teeth. "Don't look at it!" Luke screamed, but it was too late. Ella was frozen, her gaze locked with the creature's, unable to look away. The Wendigo moved slowly, its body creaking as it approached. The air grew colder, the hunger pressing down on them like a weight, as if the creature's presence alone was enough to drain the life from them. Adam tried to pull Ella away, but the creature's gaze held her. She began to shake, her eyes glazing over, as if she were falling into a trance. Then, in a moment of pure terror, Luke picked up a stick, setting it alight with the last flicker of his lighter. He thrust it toward the Wendigo, the small flame barely illuminating the creature's face. The Wendigo let out an inhuman screech, recoiling from the light. Luke took the chance, pulling Ella and Adam back, stumbling through the trees, desperate to put distance between them and the horror that had nearly consumed them. Then, in a moment of pure terror, Luke picked up a stick, setting it alight with the last flicker of his lighter. He thrust it toward the Wendigo, the small flame barely illuminating the creature's face. The Wendigo let out an inhuman screech, recoiling from the light. Luke took the chance, pulling Ella and Adam back, stumbling through the trees, desperate to put distance between them and the horror that had nearly consumed them. The town of Pine Ridge was nestled between dense forests and frozen lakes, surrounded by legends as old as the land itself. Stories of strange disappearances and eerie sightings were whispered around campfires, passed down through generations. But no tale was as chilling as that of the Wendigo, a creature of hunger and madness, born in the darkest corners of the human soul. Clara, a young journalist from the city, had heard these stories all her life. She had grown up in Pine Ridge, but left as soon as she could, eager to escape the small-town superstition and find a life of logic and reason. Now, 10 years later, she was back, reluctantly investigating a series of recent disappearances that had left the town in a state of silent terror. Everyone in town seemed to know someone who had vanished without a trace in the past few weeks. Most of the locals whispered about the Wendigo, blaming the creature for the disappearances. Clara thought it was ridiculous, until she saw something lurking in the woods herself. Clara parked her car at the edge of the forest, wrapping her coat tighter around her as the wind bit into her skin. The winter had arrived early this year, and the forest seemed to breathe in cold, ghostly mists, thick enough to make the pine trees appear like shadowy figures looming in the distance. She looked over her notes, recounting the details of the recent disappearances. 5 people had gone missing in a matter of weeks. Most were hunters or hikers, people familiar with the forest, which made their vanishing all the more mysterious. As she walked further into the woods, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The trees stood tall and silent, casting long shadows over the snow. She stopped, glancing around, her breath fogged in the cold air. But no one was there, only silence and the whisper of the wind through the branches. Clara had come prepared with her camera and a voice recorder. She was determined to find logical explanations for the disappearances, perhaps an animal, or some natural hazard hidden beneath the snow. Yet, the further she went, the more the forest seemed to press in on her, like it was alive, waiting. Clara, a determined and skeptical journalist with a knack for exposing the truth. Logical to a fault, Clara isn't one to believe in the supernatural. Joe, a local park ranger who knows the forest better than anyone. He's seen strange things in the woods, but keeps quiet, wary of sharing what he can't explain. Maggie, Clara's childhood friend, a local who stayed in Pine Ridge all her life. Superstitious and fearful, Maggie warns Clara against going too deep into the woods. Clara had met up with Joe earlier in the day. He'd been reluctant to talk at first, his eyes darting nervously around as if the forest could hear him. "There's something wrong out there," he had murmured, barely audible. "People think I'm crazy, but I've seen things, Clara. Shadows that move, whispers when there's no one around. I don't know what it is, but it's hungry." Maggie, too, had warned her. "The Wendigo is real, Clara. My grandpa used to tell me stories. It feeds on those lost in the woods. It can sense when someone's vulnerable, when they're afraid. It's waiting." Clara had laughed it off, but now, with the cold settling into her bones, the warnings echoed in her mind. Clara, a determined and skeptical journalist with a knack for exposing the truth. Logical to a fault, Clara isn't one to believe in the supernatural. Joe, a local park ranger who knows the forest better than anyone. He's seen strange things in the woods, but keeps quiet, wary of sharing what he can't explain. Maggie, Clara's childhood friend, a local who stayed in Pine Ridge all her life. Superstitious and fearful, Maggie warns Clara against going too deep into the woods. Clara had met up with Joe earlier in the day. He'd been reluctant to talk at first, his eyes darting nervously around as if the forest could hear him. "There's something wrong out there," he had murmured, barely audible. "People think I'm crazy, but I've seen things, Clara. Shadows that move, whispers when there's no one around. I don't know what it is, but it's hungry." Maggie, too, had warned her. "The Wendigo is real, Clara. My grandpa used to tell me stories. It feeds on those lost in the woods. It can sense when someone's vulnerable, when they're afraid. It's waiting." Clara had laughed it off, but now, with the cold settling into her bones, the warnings echoed in her mind. Unable to resist, Clara followed the footprints, the forest growing darker with every step. Her logical mind told her to turn back, but something compelled her forward, an insatiable curiosity mingled with a sense of dread. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of a clearing, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was stretched tight over sharp bones, giving it a skeletal appearance. Its face was hollow, with sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dusk, and a mouth that stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. The Wendigo. It looked at her, and Clara felt as if it were staring straight into her soul, pulling out every fear, every regret, every vulnerable part of her mind. She felt a cold, consuming hunger, one that didn't belong to her, but was somehow filling her thoughts, gnawing at her with an insidious desperation. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she managed to stumble back, falling into the snow. The Wendigo moved slowly, its skeletal frame gliding over the ground without disturbing the snow, as if it were floating. It opened its mouth, a low growl reverberating through the clearing, filling her ears with a sound that felt like nails scraping against bone. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature moved closer, its eyes locking onto hers, and she felt her strength drain away. She felt as though it was feeding on her fear, drawing energy from her terror as it moved closer. In a desperate attempt, Clara fumbled for her flashlight, shining it into the Wendigo's face. The creature recoiled, hissing as the light hit its hollow eyes, and she used the moment to scramble to her feet and run. Clara's lungs burned as she sprinted through the snow, branches whipping at her face as she struggled to stay on her feet. She could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps echoing, faster than she could comprehend, as if it were gliding over the snow. She remembered Joe's words, "It's hungry." The thought spurred her on, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed through the trees, searching for any sign of escape. But the forest was endless, a maze of shadows and icy branches. Finally, she saw it, the faint glow of her car's headlights in the distance. She was almost there. She forced herself to keep running, even as her legs screamed in protest, even as her vision blurred from the cold. The Wendigo was close now. She could feel its presence behind her, could smell the rotting stench of its breath, but she didn't look back. She focused on her car, the one thing that stood between her and whatever fate awaited her in the depths of the forest. She reached the car, fumbling with her keys, her hands shaking too badly to fit them into the lock. The Wendigo's shadow loomed closer, stretching over the snow, consuming everything in its path. Finally, the key turned, and Clara flung herself into the car, locking the doors just as the creature reached her. It pressed its face against the window, its hollow eyes staring at her with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. She turned the engine on, slamming the car into reverse and speeding away, the creature's twisted face disappearing into the darkness as she drove. Clara didn't stop driving until she reached the edge of Pine Ridge, where she finally pulled over, gasping for breath, her heart racing. She looked down at her hands, still shaking, her mind reeling from what she had seen. No one in town believed her story. They said she'd been out in the cold too long, that the forest had played tricks on her mind. Even Joe was hesitant to admit what he'd seen, but Clara knew the truth. She knew what lurked in the forest, waiting, hungry for the fear and despair of those who wandered too far. The disappearances never stopped. People still went missing from time to time, their belongings found scattered in the woods, with no trace of where they'd gone. And Clara, she never set foot in Pine Ridge again. But sometimes, in her dreams, she saw it, the hollow-eyed creature standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And she knew that. Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed the terror, like and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Share your thoughts below. And remember, stay close to the light. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.